It's my pleasure to make a presentation at his Kumamoto University under the able guidance and direction by our Professor Takashi and Dr. Meza. The topic of my presentation is the concept of identity and otherness, which is seen both from Indian as well as Western standpoints. One of the important principles of bioethics, according to me, is the notion of otherness, whether we treat the other, in quotes, as equal to our own self. Because most of the time we are concerned about our own identity. So let us first examine the notion of identity, and from the concept of identity, I would like to proceed to the otherness. Now, what is identity? The concept of identity became very famous or very important in the cultural studies from the 1990s. It is because of the cultural politics of feminism, human rights and multiculturalism, as well as by philosophical and linguistic concerns, there has been a new mode of thinking. So what I am trying to say is from 1990 onwards, we have been talking about the concept of identity in detail, and philosophers as well as the linguists talk about this concept. And at the same time, the concept of identity has been severely criticized. Why? It is because the concept of identity is not a universal or a fixed concept with essential identity, essential entities, but it is contingent on historically and culturally special construction of language. This means that identities are wholly cultural and cannot exist outside the representation, which means each and every person has his or her own identity. For example, I am an Indian, that is my identity. I am an Asian, that is also an identity. I am a bioethicist, that is also an identity. So all of us have identity. So all these identities emerge only in the cultural context. Outside that, perhaps it may not have any meaning. So identities are discursive construction, that is what we construct. That is descriptions of ourselves with which we identify and in which we have emotionally invested. While identities are matters of culture rather than nature, this does not mean that one can easily replace those ethnic or sexual identities into which one has been acculturized. This means that I am placed in a particular cultural historicity that I cannot change. For example, I am a Tamilian, that is my culture. So I belong to, each and every individual belongs to one's own identity. While identities are social construction, that's why we say identities are nothing but social constructions. They are ones that constitute us through the imposition of power and the identification of the psyche. Now the identity has been analyzed by Stuart Hall, and he says there are three types of identities, or three ways in which one can understand the notion of identity. One is the Enlightenment subject, which Descartes and others spoke of from the philosophical standpoint. Then the sociological subject, and the third is the de-centered or the postmodern subjects like Derrida and others who speak about that in detail. For example, the Enlightenment or the Cartesian conception of the subject pictures a conscious and unified individual marked by inherently rational capacities that allow him or her to experience and make sense of the world according to the actual properties of the world. So this is what Descartes analyzes with regard to this identity. Then the second identity is the sociological subject, where there is an interrelation between the individual and the social. The internalization of the social values and the roles acquired through the process of acculturation stabilizes the individual and ensures that they fit the social structure. Now the third one is very important according to Hall. This is a decentered subject, which means there is no subject as such. So composed not of one but of several shifting, sometimes contradictory identities. Indian philosophy has talked about this concept of identity and other in detail. For example, the issue namely identity and otherness is a basic problem for the Indian philosophers. One of the systems of Indian philosophical tradition that is known as Advaita, it means non-dualism. That is not dualism, which means it is not more than two. It doesn't mean one also. So that's why we are using the word non-dualism. So it speaks about, it is a philosophy of Advaita which talks about identity. Now what does identity according to this system mean? It means the individual and the supreme self are one and the same. Which means I as the individual self share the consciousness of the supreme. So this means I am non-different from the supreme. Though I got limited consciousness, my consciousness is part of the supreme self, so I am not different from the supreme self. Now the implication here is that when I say that I am not different from the supreme self, it means I am not different from my friend, or I am not different from the other. So both of us are identical. So once we know that both of us, both A and B are identical, there will not be any conflict. This is what is emphasized in Indian philosophical tradition. And another important system, that is Buddhism, it talks about liberation. For example, a cosmic liberation. It is a liberation of all. It is a system which has a concern for the social liberation. Because it is said, if you happen to see Buddha, this is what one modern thinker has said, if you happen to see Buddha killing, what does it mean? It means that you yourself is a Buddha. Buddhahood is present in you. So you don't have to search Buddha outside. So it talks about the cosmic liberation, that is liberation for all, attaining that means each and every one of us can attain the Buddhahood, otherwise known as Arhat. So it is nothing but the transformation of the individual. And similarly, if you come to contemporary Indian philosophy or recent Indian philosophy, we have important thinkers like Swami Vivekananda, who had a concern for the poor and the needy. He believed in a religion which can really wipe out the tears of a widow. I would like to quote him. He says, I do not believe in a religion which cannot wipe out the tears of a widow or which cannot bring a loaf of bread to an orphan's mouth. This is his modern definition of religion, which means religion must take care of the needy and the poor. In fact, he said the poor are Daridra Narayana. That's a Sanskrit word. It means they are Narayana, that means they are God, but poor God. So Swami Vivekananda, as a modern thinker, had a concern for the poor and the needy. And similarly, Sri Aurobindo, a great thinker, who talked about the cosmic salvation like Buddha. He was not concerned about one's own salvation alone. He said the salvation means the entire society has to be liberated. It is not that I am happy because I have been liberated. No, that is not liberation according to Sri Aurobindo. This means, according to Sri Aurobindo, each and every individual, the last man on earth, should also be liberated. That is what he has suggested. Then Sri Ramana Maharishi, a great saint who lived in Tamil Nadu, he has also talked about the liberation of each and every individual. Of course, Gandhi, a great thinker who has contributed for the development of the individual as well as the society. Now, now we'll go to the another important concept, namely otherness. There are different perspectives for the term otherness. There is an Indian perspective, this is especially Advaita perspective and Buddhist perspective. And also from Western side, you see the methodology given by Foucault, for example, who talked about difference. I will come to that later. Then Levinas is another important thinker, Habermas and Rorty. So all these philosophers, that is Western philosophers as well as Indian philosophers, approach the concept of otherness from Western perspective. Then we have also religious and social perspective. For example, we talk about social stratification in Hinduism. Karma is a theory which believes in life after death. And moksha, of course, means liberation. This is another perspective with regard to otherness. Then also we have got ecological perspective, which talks about the interrelation that exists between human being and nature. Then feminist perspective and hermeneutic perspective. This hermeneutic perspective is something very much important for philosophers, because we try to interpret the text so that they can be more meaningful. Which means the text can be more meaningful only if each and every individual is taken into account. It does not mean that the text is meant for some people alone. So Levinas, for example, a very important thinker who in his well-known book Totality and Infinity, an essay on exteriority, he talks about the responsibility for the other. I have the responsibility towards other. He says the concern for the other. In fact, his famous quotation goes like this: I cannot exist without the other, which means my existence has no meaning without the other. So responsibility is nothing but the proximity of the other. He says responsibility does not come from fraternity, but fraternity denotes responsibility for another antecedent to one's freedom. Of course, there are traditional understanding of the responsibility. It is known as responsibility for something, responsibility to something, and for oneself. Now, this is a traditional understanding of responsibility, but it has been remodified by Levinas, and he says this definition, the previous definition which I gave, that is the traditional understanding of responsibility is something very much restricted. So Levinas, he talked about what we call infinite responsibility. And he says it is a primary and fundamental mode of subjectivity. This means my existence purely depends on the other. And he calls it as radical responsibility. It develops the interpersonal relationship. This is most important for social understanding. So to take care of the neighbor, his sufferings and pains. This is what is very much insisted both in Indian as well as Western philosophical tradition. No one can save himself without the other. So which means the existence of the other is a prerequisite or precondition for my existence. So responsibility, according to Levinas, is a bond. It is a response and it is a recognition. And this has been analyzed by Hegel in detail. For example, Hegel talks about a parable between the master and the slave. He says the master always in need of the servant. He is totally depending on the servant. So though the slave is known as the subjugated other, without the slave the master cannot survive. So by giving a parable, Hegel explains the interrelation that exists between the master and the slave. And similarly, if you come across the modern philosophical discourse like movement like phenomenology and existentialism, they also talk about the significance of the other. PE means phenomenology and existentialism, which is based on intersubjectivity. Because if you look at the existential philosophy, it talks about the importance of the existence. Existence precedes essence is their dictum. Because we have been thinking about that's how philosophy has been crystallized from the time of Plato onwards till the emergence of the existentialist philosophy. Till then we have been talking about only essence, but it was the existential philosophers like Sartre who could successfully show that my existence is very much essential. Simply I cannot, the society cannot swallow my existence in the name of commonness. So similarly, if you come to Lacan, another important Western thinker, he talks about the existence as subject is a function, our relationship with the other. He talks about three meanings. One is the other is everything which we must learn to separate ourselves from in order to develop into adult parents. That is, he talks about the parental relationship. Then there is also the mirror image, which he says it is a fictional image of ourselves which we tend to identify with and yet must learn to conceive of as separate from the physical body. That is, my mirror image is different from my physical body. Then the third one is the realm of language and institutions in which we are socialized. So these are the three ways in which one can understand the relation with others according to Lacan. So the Western culture and the dominant ideologies have differentiated themselves from the subordinated other. The marginalized is always looked at as other. Women, for example, are separated from the patriarchal society, and in gender politics, alterity has manifested itself in one basic form, the conception of women as the other. So what I am trying to say here is that the Western culture most of the time has subordinated the other cultures, so it considered the marginalized as the other, and one example is women. And Edward Said is a very good example. He talks about how the East has been constructed by the West through literature, historiography and art, etc. Another important thinker of the West is Richard Rorty, the American philosopher, who talks about diversity. And he says that marginalized and the downtrodden, we should consider them as we. They are part of our own self. So he believes that we ought to grow in its own sensibility to the pain and humiliation of others. In fact, he is asking the question, are you suffering? Is the question which Rorty expects an answer from us. So the above question involves the other to answer it. He expects a conversation with others. And so the we, according to Richard Rorty, means it is not the exclusion of the other. It is inclusion of the other. So in a dialogue, the concept of we is not a relation of exclusion, but a condition of communication without which a subsequent perception of difference and otherness would be impossible. I'll skip this. Or also Gadamer I quoted. Similarly, Foucault is another important thinker. Another important thinker who has talked about this, the concept of otherness, is Habermas, a living philosopher who has contributed for the concept of solidarity. He says solidarity is the realization that each person must take responsibility for the other, as all association must have an interest in the integrity of their shared life contact in the same way. I'll skip this. Now, this is now I'm trying to apply this in Indian context. It's a very important problem because the social stratification in India, unfortunately, does not allow the oppressed and the suppressed to be treated on par with others. At least some of you know that Indian society is classified into four important categories. The higher caste, who are known as the Brahmins. Then the second is the warrior class, who are known as Kshatriyas. Then the Vaishyas are the business people. Then the Sudras are the downtrodden or the oppressed. And besides this is known as Varna system in Indian tradition. But besides this four system, there is also some group of people who are known as untouchables. The word, derogatory word, unfortunately, that is used in Indian tradition. And these people, they have to stay only in the graveyard. They can't come and mix with other people. So I am more concerned about their life. Social stratification in India does not allow the oppressed. They are the oppressed and the suppressed, and they are not treated on par with others. So in the name of caste, the welfare of the backward and the scheduled caste and the tribes are neglected. So the question of other here is unfortunately is meaningless. So Dr. Ambedkar, who was the pioneer in this movement, he rightly said caste has killed the public spirit. It has made public opinion impossible. Virtue has become caste-ridden and morality has become caste-based. So the purpose of human life is to show how there can be all-round progress in life and how man can have a better life. But unfortunately, in the name of caste, we segregate some people from the main class. thus it could be viewed as a critique of life. There is an inseparable relation between values and actions. But if you look at the Indian Shastras, that is Indian literature, the Pramanas, otherwise known as their own Pramanas, where high values are spoken of. But in practical life, the people who are suppressed and the oppressed, their values are completely neglected. So, the doctrinal imperative on ethics and values as discussed in the Upanishads. Upanishads, for example, it talks about the equality of all human beings. But later, when the Shastras, Manudharma Shastras was introduced, then the hierarchy came. So here what is important is, there is always a conflict between what is what and what I should be. And the Upanishads say how one should move towards what should I do. So every man, potentially every man is divine according to Hindu philosophy. So it says every man has the principle of ethical good in him, but it is always in conflict with the ego principle that corrupts one's as well as others' moral dispositions. So the superiority of the higher caste, namely the Brahmins, have this ego principle. Because of this, they are suppressing the others. So even though the sovereignty of goodness is a unifying factor, it has a risk of falling into the coerciveness of the instruments of the egohood. This means as long as you have the human ego, then there will not the place for the other. That is the message. Now, if you look at the Purusharthas means Indian values of life. We consider 4 values as most important. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, they are known as and all these values talk about the good actions that applies universally. So which means one can make a classification. The ancient systems of philosophical tradition and later philosophical tradition. In the ancient system, the values of all are taken into account. But when there is, actually what is needed, what is said in Indian tradition is, there should be a synthesis of a body, mind and speech. This is what we call dharma. But when there is a harmony between these 3 values, man and his social relations become perfect and compatible with the ground. If there is no unity among these 3 aspects, then there is no incompatibility, there is no compatibility, and as a result of that, thereby the philosophers try to say that there should be socially movement towards the concept of well-being of the society. Now, for this we suggest 2 principles that are following the footprint path of Mahatma Gandhi. One is truthfulness and the other is non-violence. Let's skip this. Here Habermasian model of the inclusion of the other is something very much useful, because Habermas talks about what is known as symmetrical relation. A symmetrical understanding is the equal relation that exists between one and the other. Most of the time we do not have this symmetrical relation. That's why he says there is problematic. Then the others are always marginalized. The dominant philosophy, if you take philosophical discourse also, there is one philosophy tries to dominate the other. The dominant philosophy rejected the existence of the other. Heidegger, Marcel, Buber, for example, they are exceptions. They say they are open to the presence of the other. Martin Buber, for example, he talks about the I-do relationship in contrast to I-it relation. This is a beautiful relation which Martin Buber speaks of. Then the postmodern philosophy is something which is remarkable, because one can say, following Foucault, that there is always a distinction between micro and macro culture. The macro culture tries to suppress the micro culture, and power always tries to suppress the knowledge structures. So there is always a rejection of fundamentalism or one culture. So we would like to transcend this by supporting all micro cultures or small cultures. So there cannot be only one culture. So this has been emphasized by Derrida, the French thinker, who says most of the time we are concerned about the center. We think that there is always one center principle, and we keep this principle at the center and all other principles go around this, and we think the center is most important. But Derrida says no, there is no such center. If you look at Indian social stratification, we consider the Brahmins or the supreme people, that they are the center, and all other groups go around that. And using Derrida's model, one can say that there is no such center. If opportunities are given, A and B can compete and they can win. There is no disparity. So whether it is a concept of Brahman or consciousness or essence, presence, in all these methodologies, Derrida says there is no center. So the philosophical discourse, which means must include different standpoints. This is my final point. That is, philosophical standpoints must allow the different standpoints. There cannot be only one methodology. So here the Jaina philosophy, Jainism has contributed a lot. So they have developed a concept of what is known as Anekantavada. This is my last slide. So that would be a possible solution. So what is Anekantavada? It takes into account the plurality of views, which means truth can be approached from different perspectives. A philosopher, J. Krishnamurti, for example, he said, there is no only one way of reaching the mountain. There are different paths and different dimensions can be seen, provided you look the mountain from different perspectives. So there is no one methodology. And Wittgenstein, for example, he said, the problems can be solved not by one way but different ways. It all depends on how you look at the problem. So the search for truth is possible by taking into account different approaches. And similarly, different religions help us in the realization of God. So there is no one religion which alone can serve as a means for all individuals. So all paths lead to God or truth. And to claim that one particular path alone is right lead to problems. So the final statement of the Anekantavada Jainism is live and let others live. So that is the principle of life. So if we accept the Jaina philosophy, then we can understand that how precious our life is, and not only our life is precious, our neighbor's life is also precious. So in this way, Indian philosophy as well as Western philosophy have given justification for both for the concept of identity and otherness. Thank you very much.
Yes, please, Sanwa.
Hello, sir. I think your last comment, life and let others life, is a principle of life, as well as with all people who do believe. Okay, but I think, in my understanding, the people in the West, they do believe in individual freedom. They want to establish the individual freedom of all people. But sometimes you often see the literatures, they usually pressurize to Asian people to establish their culture, their individual freedom, their equality. If our culture is different from them, they do believe the individual freedom to choose whatever you can. But we do not have choose our individual policy, individual practice. They always specialize over ambitiously to take their universal norms.
Yeah.
I think it's not right. We have choose individual. We have individual liberty, individual freedom to choose whatever it is prevalent to our culture. It's right. I appreciate your presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. See, one of the main issues that is discussed in both Eastern and Western philosophy, I mean Eastern discourse especially, is that there cannot be one culture. No, the what culture? That is European culture. You want to impose that culture on everything. That's why Edward Said, in his book Orientalism, talks about this. He says that East is always being suppressed by the West. What is that? You don't have knowledge. We are giving knowledge. Take it. So this attitude has been severely criticized by the postmodernists, for example. They say, no, it is not possible for us to accept one culture. Why? There is plurality of culture. No, all these cultures must be celebrated. Now I'll give one example. If you in India, there is a plurality of culture. It is a multicultural country, you know that. In it, different states are there. So each state has a language, not only language, some internal values which we have to preserve. For example, the beating of drums, that is for a particular group. Now, in the name of one culture, we cannot simply destroy it. That's why, now I'll give another example. Those days we had a cool drink called Kalimark. Some of my Tamil colleagues know that. Kalimark. That's a local cool drink prepared by our local companies. But once this other multinational cool drink came into being, they have been completely vanished. So we want to bring it back in the sense that our culture, our traditional values are important. So that is the reason why I say that it is possible provided we accept the other, right? And also you have to appreciate the values of the others.
I salute you for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask, is identity is good or bad in Indian context? For example, if I am identified, belong to the maybe lower caste community, I feel rejected, and also some oppressed. So therefore, I would like to ask you from you, is identity is good or bad in Indian context? I am asking you.
Yeah.
So thank you, sir.
Thank you for a very nice question. Now, identity, whether you like it or not, identity is there. Which means each and every one of us, we have our own identity. I am not ready to sacrifice my identity for the sake of others. Okay? So identity is good. Fine. But at the same time, identity is bad, provided you consider a group of people as belonging to a particular caste or particular community, and they say, no, you don't come to us because you are different. So the identity, whether you like it or not, it is thrusted on you. So it is there. So it has got some good aspects, but many bad aspects also. So it is both.
Okay, Professor Takahashi.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I think you said that identity are not universal, fixed or essential, but contingent on historically and culturally, especially construction of language. But in my opinion, there are some levels of identity. So, for example, racial identity, sexual identity, so social identity, psychological identity, and religious or philosophical identity. Because the inner life, according to Indian philosophy, individual and supreme self are the same. In the individual and the supreme self are the same.
Yeah.
You said.
Yeah.
Here, individual is a kind of identity, and this is not culturally constructed, but it's a universal or a fixed identity. So religious or philosophical identity.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for your very nice question. First of all, I would like to say that when I say identity is something not universal and it is social constructed, in a particular society it emerges. For example, I am son of so and so, I am a father of so and so, I am a student of so and so, I am a teacher of so and so, I belong to a particular religion. So I belong to that religion. So these are all something which are not universal. So when I grow up, all these are attached to me. Once, for example, when I was a child, I never believed in not as a child. Sorry, when I was a college student, I never believed in religion. At that time, I didn't have any religious identity. But now I have a religious identity. So that's why we say it is social construct. It is not something which is already existing. So when you grow up, it something is attached to you. So that's why I say it is something social construct. But with regard to Indian philosophical tradition, when I say the individual self and the supreme self are identical, what we mean is, this is especially particular with regard to a particular tradition called Advaita, where it is said the individual is non-different from a Brahman. Say, let us say, it is a very abstract term. Let me say some supreme being, though that is not a correct word. What is important is the consciousness which I possess as an individual is something which is very much available in the supreme self. So consciousness is the only identical thing. Apart from that, I do not have any identity. My name as Sivanandam Pannerselvam is only a label that is given to me. So if that label is removed, then I am non-different from my friends. So only what is identity? Your consciousness is identity. So though there is a difference between the universal consciousness and the individual consciousness, we are separated because I am a limited being, whereas the supreme self is unlimited. It is omnipresent, omniscient, and omniscient. So that is only the difference. So apart from that, I don't have identity. According to this tradition, I don't have any identity because all these labels, all this attachment I have is only temporary and they are not permanent. So in that case also we can say it is not something which is fixed. So let me give one more example also. It is something like saying A is equivalent to B. Now how can we say A is equivalent to B? Definitely A and B are two different entities. That's why A and B we say. Then how can we say A and B are identical? We say that what is available in A is also available in B. So what is available in A is nothing but consciousness. What is available in B is also consciousness. So with regard to consciousness, both A and B are one and the same. Apart from that, there is no distinction. So there is no identity. Please.
If you are identified with supreme self,
Yeah.
in some situation. So what is you individual? You as a teacher or you as a man, or not only conscious, but conscious has content. So very abstract consciousness. Then this is spirit. All the attributes are spirit. Then pure consciousness.
Pure consciousness.
Identities. So then social and sexual psychological identity are all spirit. And then you, only you, so consciousness.
Yes.
Identity.
Yes. See, thank you, Professor. See, when I say, for example, when I make a statement, I am the owner of this house, I own a car. So here, what does this I mean? The word I here means the body. But we are not talking about body in Indian philosophical sense. We are concerned about the self or consciousness. So when I say I am the owner of this or that, or I am fat, I am short, I am lean, etc., all these have a reference only to body. But body can be changed. When we, in the case of personal identity, we say body can be changed after 20 years. You may not be in a position to recognize me, for example, because my body might change, I am saying. But what is important or what is something, that's why we say it is something called social construct. But in the case of identity, in the case of self or what we call the consciousness, I and the Supreme share the consciousness, that it cannot be destroyed. But there is a distinction. What is that? My consciousness is limited, which means I have limited knowledge, but the Supreme Self has got infinite knowledge. He has got infinite bliss. So that is only different. So for consciousness, there is no identity. Consciousness is something which is available in me. So we call it the person. The person refers to body, whereas the self refers to consciousness. So here, of course, a metaphysical understanding we are using. So there is a distinction. So if you look at the body, then I am not different from the other. So I don't have any identity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Sanma, Sanma, thank you.
Hello, sir. I have a question, please.
Yeah, please.
You know, we have mostly been influenced by the Western philosophical thought.
Yeah.
Especially in Asian cultures. But I need a suggestion from you. How can we could protect our traditions, our policies, our practices? How can we protect our identity from the Western influences? I think some suggestions from you.
So I feel that we have to retain our identity because it belongs to us. I belong to a particular religion. My identity is something precious, and I am not ready to sacrifice it for the sake of others. Similarly, as a Muslim, one has identity that cannot be sacrificed. So the values. So I am considering the religious values are something very precious and very much important.
Does it only the religious factor? Maybe it's cultural factor. As I discussed with Professor Jaffrey sometimes before, and he told me this is the main factor is cultural. Religion is one window of the culture. All things and all practices which are discussed with the cultural window. Maybe culture is the great context, and religion is a small context.
Yeah. Here I would like to quote Gandhi, though I am not using the same phrase of Gandhi. Gandhi said, I am ready to open my windows so that other culture can let it enter into my house. But at the same time, I should not be carried away by that. Which means my values are important. I am not ready to sacrifice my values under any circumstance. So whether it is religious or cultural or social, these values of a particular country or particular region has to be preserved. And we cannot simply give up these values for the sake of others. Yeah, please.
I think it's very interesting what you have to say. Just a couple of comments. You know what we call Western philosophy, I would call it just modernist philosophy. One of the things about those philosophers was that the philosophies they propagated, they thought them very thoroughly through on how they could be made practical in the legal systems, in the political systems, in the social systems. Now, it's all very well talking about Indian philosophy. There is nothing of the Indian philosophy in the Indian constitution, in the political system, or in modern India. You cannot keep on blaming the British because it's now 60 years after independence. And surely there must have been some political thinkers by now, who could have offered an alternative. You talk about Gandhi. Gandhi just makes headlines. He doesn't tell us anything on how a constitutional system would evolve from that. Voltaire didn't make headlines. He wrote a whole book on how it would be effective. Hobbes didn't write headlines. He wrote a whole book on how the state could be introduced on those individual rights. So there is a complete dichotomy in what India really is and what Indians say Indian philosophy is. The second thing is, I have a comment that I think there's too much generalization. There were many social movements in Indian history, Buddhism, for instance, which destroyed the whole caste issue. Sikhs destroyed the caste issue in Punjab. So it's unfair to say Indians. You may talk about some Indians or a majority Indians. You should not talk about all Indians in general like that. One of the reasons in Gurdwaras we sit on the floor is because we destroyed caste. In fact, in Punjab, to call somebody a Brahmin is a derogatory word. And in the Indian history, the Maurya kingdom, the Maurya was the longest kingdom, surviving kingdom, for 400 years. They came from the third Varna systems. They weren't even Kshatriyas over Brahmins. So my request to you and is to all other Indian academics is, give us some practical implications of all this philosophy. Either it's a dead philosophy which belongs to the past. If it has value of me and not the other being me, how can it be manifested in a constitutional and a political system which can create some harmony within India?
What I would like to say is that it is now the need of the hour to go back to our own tradition. It is not simply right on our part to blame the Western traditional systems, but we have to go back to the tradition, especially the Vedas and Upanishads, and see how much they can contribute. And there is also, that's why I said the hermeneutical method is one important method where we can reinterpret the tradition. What is my role in the tradition? What do I do with the text? It has to be meaningful provided I participate in it. That's why we are emphasizing now that the need of the hour is to look back our tradition and see the ancient values. We have to preserve these values, and in the name of modernization we cannot lose our values.
Last question. Thank you.
Because, yeah, you need a marvelous system with the concept of identity and difference. Okay? But we have some kind of confusion here. Because we talk about identity, we say personal identity, that's what we like to talk about.
Yeah.
Maybe self-identity,
Yeah.
usually how you value your own self-identity by some identity, or you are talking about cultural identity. I think the Finnish will talk about sociological, social identity. They don't have too much interest in this kind of cultural things. Or I think your alchemy thing seems talking about ontological identity. So we want to talk about how I'm related to God or something like that. God, just talking about things rational identity, but chaos I think. So maybe it's better we could draw some distinction between different kinds of identity, so that we could make clear, more clear about what we want to present to us. Thank you.
I'll just take 1 minute to answer you. I would like to say that the identity, though initially we have been talking about the personal identity, you are talking about that in Bepu. Personal identity, self-identity, and now the concept of identity has been elaborated further, in the sense that we are concerned about the society, especially when we are talking about the Indian philosophical tradition. What is that it can offer to the social problems? We are not interested in doing some armchair philosophy. What philosophy can offer for social problems? So that's why the concept of identity in Indian philosophical tradition is little broadened, so that we can talk about the problems of the society.